Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 192, November 18th to November 24th, 1864. Last week, we discussed Sherman's march to the sea. While not total war, he is doing a good job of undermining the ability of the Georgians from continuing their resistance. Once in Savannah, he's going to turn his attention elsewhere, but we will cover that in a future episode. This week, we will cover two events, one being a covert operation, and the other being a continuation of the Colorado War. If you remember, we will revisit John Shivington, who is the hero of Glorieta Pass, and conduct an operation that's going to win him the opposite of glory in the Sand Creek Massacre. But first, let's talk about the Confederate attempt to set fire to New York. Before we do that, though, let's talk about our Patreon content. And as we get here into November, we have a episode posted as a movie review, Alvarez Kelly, that talks about the beefsteak raid, and we talked about Wade Hampton and the beefsteak raid back a couple episodes ago. Here, still part of the Petersburg campaign. So we compared the historical accuracy to that movie, and if that sounds like it would be something you would be interested in to hear, a historical synopsis and a review of the accuracy as well, we do have a couple of those posted on the Patreon, and as well as picture slideshows and memoir reviews. So if any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They're greatly appreciated. Now you might be noticing that the Confederates are getting fairly desperate in their attempt to strike at the Union. When we last talked about covert operations, we talked about the raid on St. Albans, Vermont. This week, we have an event that is similar in that it is not well known and probably fairly ambitious in terms of diverting troops from the actual war fronts. On the surface, we might understand the logic. When the draft riots happened, there were combat veterans sent to restore order. So while that might seem wild, it is not without there being some kind of thought. Destruction of the city might lead to hampering, at least in terms of some kind of manufacturing capacity for the North, destroy the avenue in which more immigrant soldiers are coming into the fold, and maybe gain some legitimacy abroad. Basically, though, it's going to be a Hail Mary of sorts. Fires would be started simultaneously across the city at several hotels and other spots, including P.T. Barnum's museum. If all the fires were going off, then it could overwhelm the city's fire brigades. Many of the fires, though, would fail to start, and the operatives were apprehended very quickly. We do have a first-hand account from one of the agents participating in the raid, who had actually also infiltrated from Canada. I found the place in a basement on the west side of Washington Place. The heavy-built old man I met wore a long beard. All I had to do was tell him that Captain Longmire had sent me for his valet. He handed it over the counter without saying a word. I turned and departed with the same silence. The leather valet was about 2.5 feet long and heavy. I had to change hands every 10 steps to carry it. No carriage was in sight. I had not expected it to be so heavy. But I reached the city square and it safely and boarded a streetcar which started there for Central Park. The car was crowded, and I had to put the valet in front of me on the floor in the passway, as the seats ran full length on either side of the car. I soon began to smell a peculiar odor, a little like rotten eggs, and I noticed the passengers were conscious of the same presence. But I sat unconcerned until my getting off place was reached, when I took and went out. I heard a passenger say as I alighted, "There must be something dead in that." When I looked into our cottage, the boys were waiting and glad of my safe return. I was given the key with the valet and opened it at once with a curiosity to investigate the contents. None of the party knew anything about Greek fire, except that the moment it was exposed to the air, it would blaze and burn everything it touched. We found it to be liquid resembling water. It was put up in 4-ounce bottles, securely sealed. There were 12 dozen bottles. We were now ready to create a sensation in New York. It had been agreed that our fires would be started in the hotels so as to do the greatest damage in the business district on Broadway. The 8 members of our party had each taken a room at 3 of the 4 hotels. In doing this, we would buy a black glazed satchel for $1 and put an overcoat in it for baggage. The room at each hotel was used enough to show that it was being occupied. In leaving, of course, the overcoat would be worn and the satchel left empty. So also, just side note, Greek fire was actually also the intention of the St. Albans raid. Remember that they tried to have that be sort of the havoc point, right, where they're going to rob these banks and then the Greek fire is going to occupy everybody and then they're going to escape into Canada. So a very similar kind of operation here. It was agreed that our operation should begin promptly at 8 o'clock so that the guests of the hotels might all escape, as we did not want to destroy any lives. We separated to meet at the same place the next evening. And then actually skip ahead a little bit, they actually are able to plant everything here in the hotels. We soon related to each other our experience. Kennedy said that after he touched off his hotels, he concluded to go to Barnum's Museum and stay until something turned up, but had only been there a few minutes when alarms began to ring all over the city. He decided to go out, and coming down the stairway, it happened to be clear at a turn, and the idea occurred to him that there would be fun to start a scare. He broke a bottle of Greek fire, he said, on the edge of the step like he would crack an egg. It blazed up, and he got out to witness the result. He had been down there at the crowd ever since, and the fires at the Astor House and the City Hotel had been put out. We had listened to the talk of the people and heard the opinion expressed generally that rebels were in the city to destroy it. He thought our presence must be known. Harrington had broke a bottle in the Metropolitan Theater at 8 o'clock, just after he fired the Metropolitan Hotel adjoining. And Ashbrook had done likewise in Ibla's Garden Theater adjoining the Lafarge Hotel. We went to the crowd on Broadway and stopped at these places to see what happened. There was the wildest excitement imaginable. There were all sorts of talk about hanging the rebels to lampposts or burning them at the stake. Still, we discovered that all was surmise apparently. So far as we could learn, the program had been carried out, but it appeared that all had made a failure. It seemed to us that there was something wrong with our Greek fire. So again, it actually very much mirrors our St. Albans raid because the Greek fire, of course, fails there. And you can also see the tone is a little bit different, right, than maybe they would have been expecting from the city folk, right? There had been some very violent opposition to our draft, but now they are definitely talking about hanging these rebels. So definitely a little bit of a shift in tone. All had observed, but the fires had been put out in the places as easily as ordinary fire. We came to the conclusion that Longmire and his manufacturing chemist had put up a job on us after it was found that we could not be dissuaded from our purpose. Martin and I got together and agreed and found lodging about 2 o'clock. We did not wake until 10 o'clock next day. We went to a restaurant on Broadway near 12th Street for breakfast. It was crowded, but everyone was reading a newspaper. After giving our order, we got the Herald, World, Tribune, and Times, and to our surprise, the entire front pages were given up to the sensational accounts of the attempt to burn the city. It was plainly pointed out that the rebels were at the head of the incendiary work, and quite a list of names was given of parties who had been arrested. All our fictitious names registered at the different hotels were given, and interviews with the clerks described us all. The clerk of the United States Hotel especially gave a minute description of my personal appearance, clothing, manners, and actions. He said I did not eat a meal at the hotel, though I had been there 2 days as a guest, and had nothing in my black satchel. It was stated in the papers that the authorities had a full knowledge of the plot, and the ringleaders would be captured during the day. One paper said the baggage of 2 of them had been secured, and all avenues of escape being guarded, the villains were sure to be caught, the detectives having a full knowledge of the rebels and their haunts. As soon as we finished our breakfast, we slipped out and took a car for Central Park. Here we loafed and read the afternoon papers, which indicated that there had been some knowledge of our crowd. Although from arrests that had been made, we thought the authorities were on a cold trail. We left the park at 4 o'clock in the afternoon to go down and get supper and see what appeared in the extra editions which were being issued. Now the rest of the account actually goes on to talk about how this individual and his companion, Colonel Martin, are able to escape back into Canada, escape the city. But obviously, several of their other conspirators were captured, right? the overall operation ends in a failure. And it really does kind of highlight, right, how desperate the Confederates are by this stage in the war. They are trying everything, pulling out all the stops, as I mentioned, a kind of Hail Mary of sorts, where they are trying to burn New York City. And obviously, if that happens, is there a big momentum shift in the war? Probably not, right? Obviously, there's probably going to be some sort of diverting of troops, but there's already such a manpower advantage at this point in the war that it's probably not going to matter, right? And even if, for some reason, there is kind of an impact here, it's not going to win you any favors for the public. You know, they mentioned in the account how they don't want to harm anybody. They're just trying to obviously create a sensation, destroy certain targets, take away this city as a war-making piece on the table. But even if you do that, if you're burning people's homes, it's not going to really win you any favors. You know, we saw this in a very limited example with the Chambersburg raid that had been conducted, right? There was a retaliatory kind of effort into Pennsylvania where Confederates burned the town. There's a lot of negative press for that. So you're not necessarily going to be winning the hearts and minds of the people, which is something you're kind of hoping for, right? There'd already been a plot earlier that failed in Chicago that was supposed to happen during Election Day that did not get carried out in the end. But you're trying to disrupt things, right? But you're also trying to do it in a way where people are going to stop wanting to continue to wage war. So it's a very complicated and quite far-reaching, I guess we should say, venture here to burn New York City. On November 29th, we have an unfortunate event being the massacre at Sand Creek. This would be conducted by troops under John Chivington, thus the alternative name of the Chivington Massacre. Now, if you recall, we mentioned the 1851 Laramie Treaty signed with the tribes in the Colorado Territory. However, the finding of gold had of course changed the terms. Thus, encroachment would lead to violence. Since settlers started moving in on Cheyenne and Arapaho lands, amongst others, the warrior society of the Dog Soldiers especially had decided to take vengeance. Almost 100 had been killed in raids, sparking of course skirmishing with regiments protecting the territory. Remember that Chivington may have exaggerated the violence in order to not be sent to Kansas, and probably into Missouri, where he might have actually faced some serious combat against Sterling Price and his command as it launched its Missouri expedition, ending at Westport. Obviously, there's also the threat of guerrillas. You don't want to necessarily be involved in that if you don't have to, right? So Chivington might be fabricating some of these stories to make sure he stays where he is. You know, Kansas, obviously, we talked about how close Sterling Price gets to Kansas in his raid, Battle of Westport, whatnot. He probably would have been deployed in that action had he been in the area. Regardless, there was a recognized problem of violence continuing, and olive branches had been sent to the Cheyenne. There were those who did not want war, and so it was indicated if the camps were to come to Fort Lyon, which is a little south and east of Denver, then there could be peace and supplies given to any turning themselves in. Black Kettle of the Cheyenne led his people, which included several other chiefs and some Arapaho, to this location, but they would be turned away by the post commander. Instead, they were instructed to make camp several miles north at Big Sandy Creek. In order to show the peaceful nature of the camp, it was instructed to fly the United States flag with a white flag under it at Black Kettle's lodge, which he did. John Chivington would arrive at Fort Lyon with the 3rd Colorado and gain more volunteers to join him against the encampment at Sand Creek. Many soldiers already at Fort Lyon would protest, as the bands had been given a promise of protection. Despite these men ordering their commands to hold their fire, enough of Chivington's command would open up on the peaceful encampment in the morning of November 29th. Artillery included, the Cheyenne would attempt to resist or be put to flight. Now we have a letter from Silas Sewell, an eyewitness of the attack, and one of the officers who protested. 2 days after you left here, the 3rd Regiment with a battalion of the 1st arrived, having moved so secretly that they were not aware of their approach until they had pickets around the post, allowing no one to pass out. They arrested Captain Bent and John Vogel and placed guards around their homes. Then they declared their intention to massacre the friendly Indians camped on Sand Creek. Major Anthony gave all information and eagerly joined in with Shevington and Co., and ordered Lieutenant Kramer with his whole company to join the command. As soon as I knew of their movement, I was indignant, as you would have been were you here. And were you here, you went to Cannon's room, where a number of officers of the 1st and 3rd were congregated, and told them that any man who would take part in the murders, knowing the circumstances we did, was a low-lived coward, son of a bitch. Captain J.J. Johnson and Lieutenant Harding went to camp and reported to Shevington, telling the whole outfit what I had said, and you can bet that hell was to pay at camp. Shevington and all hands swore that they would hang me before they moved camp, but I stuck it out, and all the officers of the post, except Anthony, backed me. We arrived at Black Kettle and Left Hand's camp at daylight. Lieutenant Wilson with companies C and E and G were ordered in advance to cut off their herd. He made a circle to the rear and formed a line 200 yards from the village and opened fire. Poor old John Smith and Louderbeck ran out with white flags, but they paid no attention to them, and they ran back to their tents. Anthony with companies D, K, and G to within 100 yards and commenced firing. I refused to fire and swore that none but a coward would. For by this time, hundreds of women and children were coming toward us and getting on their knees for mercy. Anthony shouted, "Kill the sons of bitches." Smith and Louderbeck came to our command. Although I am confident there were 200 shots fired at them, fired an officer to say that old Smith and anyone who sympathized with the Indians ought to be killed, and now was a good time to do it. The battery then came up in our rear and opened on them. I took my company across the creek, and by this time the whole of the 3rd and the batteries were firing into them, and you can form some idea of the slaughter. When the Indians found that there was no hope for them, they went for the creek and buried themselves in the sand. I got under the blankets, and some of the bucks got their bows and a few rifles and defended themselves as well they could. By this time, there was no organization amongst our troops. They were a perfect mob, every man on his own hook. My company was the only one that kept their formation, and we did not fire a shot. The massacre lasted 6 or 8 hours, and a good many Indians escaped. I tell you, Ned, it was hard to see little children on their knees have their brains beat out by men professing to be civilized. One squaw was wounded, and a fellow took a hatchet to finish her. She held her arms up and defended her, and he cut one arm off, and held the other with the one, and dashed the hatchet through her brain. One squaw with her 2 children were on her knees begging for their lives, of a dozen soldiers within 10 feet of them, all firing. When one succeeded in hitting the squaw in the thigh, when she took a knife and cut the throat of both her children, and then killed herself. One old squaw hung herself in the lodge, but there was not enough room for her to hang, and she held up her knees and choked herself to death. Some tried to escape on the prairie, but most of them were run down by horsemen. I saw 2 Indians hold one of another's hand, chased until they were exhausted, when they kneeled down and clasped each other around the neck and were both shot together. They were all scalped, and as high as half a dozen taken from one head. They were all horribly mutilated. One woman was cut open and a child taken out of her and scalped. White Antelope, War Bonnet, and a number of others had ears and privates cut off. Squaw snatches were cut for trophies. You would think it impossible for white men to butcher and mutilate human beings as they did there, but every word I have told you is the truth, which they do not deny. It was almost impossible to save any of them. Charlie Otterby saved John Smith and Windsor Squaw. I saved little Charlie Bent. George Bent was killed. Jack Smith was taken prisoner and murdered the next day in his tent by one of Dunn's Company E. I understand the man received a horse for doing this job. They were going to murder Charlie Bent, but I run him into the fort. They were going to kill old Uncle John Smith, but Lieutenant Cannon and the boys at Fort Lyon interfered and saved him. They would have murdered old Bent's family if Colonel Tappan had not taken the matter in hand. Kramer went up with 20 men, and they did not want to tangle with so many of the first. Shevington has gone to Washington to be made general, I suppose, and get authority to raise 9 months' regiments to hunt Indians. He said Downing will have me cashiered if possible. If they do, I want you to help me. I think they'll try the same for Kramer, for he has shot his mouth off a good deal, and did not shoot his pistol off in the massacre. Joe has behaved first rate during this whole affair. Shivington reports 500 or 600 killed, but there were not more than 200, about 140 women and children, and 60 bucks. A good many were hunting buffalo. Our best Indians were killed. Black Kettle, One Eye, Minimek, and Left Hand. Pierce of Company F was killed trying to save John Smith. There was one other of the first killed, and 9 of the third, all through their own fault. They would get up to the edge of the bank and look over to get a shot at any Indian under them. When the women were killed, the bucks did not seem to try and get away, but fought desperately. Charlie Ottoby wished me to write all about it to you. He says he would have given anything if you could have been there. I suppose Joe Kramer has written to you all the particulars, so I will write half. Your family as well. Billy Walker, Colonel Tappan, Wilson. Start for Denver in the morning. There's not news I can think of. I expect we will have a hell of a time with the Indians this winter. We have 200 men at the post, Anthony in command. I think he will be dismissed when the facts are known in Washington. Give my regards to any friends you come across, and write as soon as possible. So there we have a very thorough and graphic account of the raid, and obviously it kind of leads you to wonder exactly, what the motivation is behind this. And you really have to wonder. There's actually a very good History on Fire episode, another podcast, that talks about this, and what exactly leads you to just kind of like unleashing the slaughter, right, onto these people. Now, there are many estimates for the loss of life. However, it is somewhere between 69 and 600, mostly women and children being killed. That cost some 24 killed and 52 wounded from Shivington's outfit. We actually have 2 more eyewitness accounts that are quite harrowing. This is from John S. Smith in his congressional testimony, and we actually mentioned Smith in Silas Sewell's account. I saw the bodies of those lying there cut all to pieces, worse mutilated than any I'd ever seen before. The women cut to pieces. With knives, scalped, their brains knocked out. Children 2 or 3 months old, all ages lying there, from sucking infants up to warriors. By whom were they mutilated? By the United States troops. Here we have another from Robert Bent. I saw one squaw lying on the bank. His legs had been broken. A soldier came up to her with a drawn saber. She raised her arm to protect herself. He struck, breaking her arm. She rolled over and raised her other arm. He struck, breaking that, and then he left her without killing her. I saw one squaw cut open with an unborn child lying by her side. Now, Shivington is going to be investigated by the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. His command had taken battle trophies, including scalps, and had otherwise mutilated the bodies. This is actually well recorded. Shivington would essentially be ruined by the event. The committee would state, as to Colonel Shivington, your committee can hardly find fitting terms to describe this conduct. Wearing the uniform of the United States, which should be the emblem of justice and humanity, holding the important position of commander of a military district, and therefore having the honor of the government to an extent in his keeping, he deliberately planned and executed a foul and dastardly massacre, which would have disgraced the veriest savage amongst those who were the victims of his cruelty. Having full knowledge of their friendly character, having himself been instrumental to some extent in placing them in their position of fancied security, he took advantage of their inapprehension and defenseless condition to gratify the worst passions that ever cursed the heart of man. In conclusion, your committee are of the opinion that, for the purpose of vindicating the cause of justice and upholding the honor of the nation, prompt and energetic measures should be at once taken to remove from office those who have thus disgraced the government by whom they are employed, and to punish, as to their crimes deserve, those who have been guilty of these brutal and cowardly acts. So it's actually interesting, the verbiage that they have in here. It's like they're saying that there was not going to be savagery on the level participated by those who were massacred, right? They're saying essentially the Cheyenne, the Arapaho would not have done the things that they did to the United States soldiers, the 3rd Colorado. So that kind of leads us to the next question. It's kind of like, why? Why did this happen, right? Well, part of it is that you do have a war situation where it is a very irregular warfare, a guerrilla war, and in cases where it's kind of hit-and-run tactics, this can have a huge psychological bearing on the soldiers involved, right? And we see this certainly in other conflicts of a very similar action, right, taken. Part of it could also be Chivington had his star rise in 1862, and he doesn't necessarily want there to be any falling of that star, right? So if you have a supposed encampment of hostiles and you're eliminating them with pretty heavy casualties on the other side, and you're essentially ending this Colorado War, then yeah, that could go toward his prestige. He could gain rank there, right? So it's kind of an underestimation of exactly how the moralities of these men who are going to be opposed to this action are going to react. And then obviously we have individuals like Silas Sewall who are come forward. They're going to testify in front of the Joint Committee. And obviously they're going to, and we heard Silas Sewall's account here in a letter, right? They're going to say the same thing. And I would like to add, not necessarily without peril to their own careers and even lives in some cases, right? Silas Sewall is actually assassinated very shortly after the war's conclusion in 1865 because of his testifying before Congress, because of the things that he said about Chivington, right? Chivington is still very popular in Colorado. A lot of these individuals who are in Colorado, who are officers, who are men, don't take kindly to him testifying against them, right? So it is a deadly proposition to even do the right thing. So I would like to say kind of there is this understanding of moral correctness, at least in our modern lens on one side, but there's also kind of like the other side of that. So it's kind of like a 50-50 proposition there. Everywhere that Chivington would go thereafter, he would be marred by the Sand Creek Massacre, which until his death in 1894, he would state was a successful operation. Cheyenne would continue to resist, their tribal structure being disrupted by the deaths of many chiefs at Sand Creek. While Black Kettle continued to sue for peace, despite the massacre, really many would just join the Dog Soldiers and the violence would continue. And actually that's also kind of an ironic setback of Sand Creek, is that these individuals who were willing to make peace had come to the negotiation table, so to speak, and then they were eliminated, right? So strong voices within that community, and we've talked about this many times in some of these other actions against Native Americans where it's not the same as just one nation where there's one person speaking. Obviously, there are all these leaders, and if you have enough of them on your side, then yeah, you're going to see less violence, less resistance, right? And so it's kind of a sad side effect of this massacre, in that these individuals were willing to make peace, and they had already come to Fort Lyon and had the olive branch. So very sad indeed, and a setback toward ending the violence in this region. So we'll wrap it up there for this week. We covered more Confederate covert operations with the attempt to burn down Manhattan, a seemingly desperate effort. We also covered an unfortunate event in the Sand Creek Massacre, which is probably one of the better-known events regarding Native Americans during the Civil War. Next week, we will turn back to John Bell Hood and his army. We need to fight an engagement that would see the second largest Confederate assault of the war, the unfortunate Battle of Franklin. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns, the email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening, and have a great week.